My brother pulled me aside at my son's funeral, and what he said next changed everything I thought I knew about the last 12 years of my life. His name was Daniel Ferreira, my brother, 2 years older than me, the one who used to steal my Halloween candy and convince me it was a tax. We had grown up close, the way siblings do when they are sharing a bedroom wall and a bathroom, and parents who worked double shifts and still somehow made every school play. I loved him. Past tense, present tense, I am still figuring out which one is accurate. My son Mateo was 12 years old when he died. 12. He had his father's forehead and my grandmother's dark eyes and a laugh that started somewhere in his stomach and worked its way up like a question mark. He died on a Tuesday in February, and the world kept moving, and I kept not understanding why. My husband, Rodrigo, had died 8 months before that. Heart attack, unexpected, the kind that takes a man who is 51 and coaches Little League and still has a full head of hair. So by the time we buried Mateo, I had already buried the other person who knew me best. I was 39 years old and I had buried my whole family in under a year. That is the only version of context that matters here. Everything else is explanation. The funeral was held at St. Augustine's on Maplewood, the same church where Rodrigo and I had been married, which my mother said was either beautiful or unbearable, and she could not decide which. There were 62 people in those pews. I counted because I could not stop counting things that day. Flowers, rose, people who looked away when I looked at them. I was wearing a black dress I had bought for Rodrigo's funeral 8 months before because I could not bring myself to buy a new one. Some economies are not about money. Daniel was beside me through most of the service. He had flown in from Portland, and he smelled like an airplane and old coffee, and he kept touching my shoulder at intervals, the way people do when they want to help but do not know how. I was grateful for it. I was grateful for him. And then the reception started. We were in the church hall, the long room with the folding tables and the casseroles brought by people from the neighborhood, and I was standing near the window holding a cup of tea I had not drunk, and Daniel came and stood beside me. He said he needed to tell me something. His voice had a texture I had not heard from him before, something careful in it, something measured in the way that things are measured when they have been practiced. I looked at him. He said we should step into the hallway. I followed him because he was my brother and we had just buried my son, and I did not have the instinct left to refuse anything. What he told me in that hallway was this: that for the last 8 years of Mateo's life, it was Daniel who had been raising him. Not in the way of proximity, not in the way of the fun uncle who shows up at Christmas with good presents. He meant it literally. He meant the school pickups and the homework and the pediatric appointments and the money for things I thought Rodrigo had been covering. He meant the phone calls I did not know about and the weekends I thought Mateo was at his father's work conference or his cousin's house. 8 years, he said. 8 years of moments I never knew existed. I did not scream. I did not cry. What I did was ask him to repeat what he had said. Not to me privately. I asked him to come back into the hall and say it again in front of everyone. He hesitated. I was already walking. Let me tell you how we got here. Rodrigo Ferreira and I met at a conference in Chicago when I was 26 years old. He was working for a mid-sized logistics company, sharp and a little formal, the kind of man who irons his shirts even on travel days. I was finishing my second year as a junior analyst at a financial advisory firm in Columbus, Ohio, and I had $23,000 in student loan debt and a very clear 5 year plan that did not include falling in love at a hotel bar. We were married 14 months later in a small ceremony that my mother said was too simple and my father said was perfect. My father was right, but he usually was. My mother, Alina Scott, biological mother, my blood, is the kind of woman who has always operated under the assumption that the room will eventually organize itself around her preferences. She is not a cruel woman. That is important to say. She is, in many ways, a loving woman. She just has a particular hierarchy in her head about which love counts for more, and for reasons I spent most of my 30s untangling, I had never ranked as high as Daniel in that hierarchy. Daniel was the one with the plan, she always said. Daniel was the one who knew where he was going. Daniel, for the record, had spent most of his 20s drifting between sales jobs and a ceramics phase that lasted 11 months and a brief period where he was going to open a food truck. I loved him through all of it. I did not rank it. By the time Mateo was born, I was 31 and I had moved up at the advisory firm to the point where I was managing a small portfolio of mid-market clients and pulling a real salary for the first time in my life. Rodrigo had changed jobs, moved into something in supply chain consulting, and we had bought a house in a suburb of Columbus that we both said was temporary, but both knew was not. Mateo came in October. He was born 2 weeks early and screaming, which I thought was a personality preview, and turned out to be exactly right. The first time Daniel came to visit after Mateo was born, he sat in our kitchen for 3 hours and held the baby and cried a little, which I did not expect from him. He was good with Mateo from the beginning, easy in a way that some people are with children without trying. Rodrigo was loving but a little stiff, the way men who were raised by serious fathers sometimes are with small children. Daniel just sat on the floor and made faces and did not seem to care whether he was being watched. I thought it was generosity. I thought it was love. I was not wrong, exactly. I was just not asking the right questions about what else it might be. Here is the first thing I noticed, in retrospect, that I filed under the wrong category. Rodrigo traveled a lot for work. It was not unusual. The consulting job required it. But in the years when Mateo was between 4 and 7, the travel became heavier, and Daniel started appearing to fill the gaps in a way that felt natural, and also, now that I am going back through it, that felt slightly too prepared. He would call on the exact day Rodrigo was leaving. He would have availability on the exact weekends Mateo had activities. My mother said once that it was wonderful how close Daniel and Mateo were becoming. I agreed. I told Rodrigo, who said something vague about family being important, and changed the subject. The second thing I noticed but did not question was money. Rodrigo handled our finances, which was a choice I had made not out of helplessness but out of division of labor. I handled the client work, the analysis, the career. He handled the household accounts, the mortgage, the investment tracking. I had my own accounts, my own work income, and I was contributing to a college fund for Mateo through an advisor I had set up independently. A separate account that I had opened when Mateo was 3 months old and funded quietly through a portion of my bonuses each year. By the time of Rodrigo's death, that account held just over $106,000. I was proud of it. It was mine. What I did not have was visibility into what Rodrigo was doing with his income, the household portion, the consulting fees, the investment accounts in his name. I had access to the joint account. The rest I trusted. Marriage, when it is working, involves a kind of functional trust that can look from the outside like inattention. I was not inattentive, I was trusting. I understand now the difference. My mother had always been politely skeptical of my career. That is the most accurate way I can describe it. She understood it enough to mention it at dinners, but not enough to ask the real questions. When I moved into portfolio management, she told my aunt that she thought it sounded stressful. When I closed my first significant contract, a mid market manufacturing client that brought a substantial fee to the firm, she said she hoped I was not neglecting the home. When I made senior analyst and my salary crossed into a bracket she would have found surprising, she told me at Christmas that she was glad I had found something stable. She told me once, at a Sunday dinner when Mateo was 6, that maybe I should consider something with more predictable hours. Something that would let me be home more. She said it gently, the way she says most things, with the texture of concern and the structure of instruction. I did not correct her. I went home that night and moved another portion of my year-end bonus into Mateo's college account. It had been growing for 6 years at that point. It was the quietest pride I had. Daniel was at that dinner. He had nodded along to my mother's advice. He had not defended me. I noticed. I filed it. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that particular silence feels like. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It just sits in the room like furniture you have learned to walk around. There was a financial advisor I had begun working with independently, a woman named Christine Ackafer, who had her own firm downtown and who had been helping me structure the college account and some separate investment positions I had been building since before Mateo was born. Christine was precise and unsentimental, and she had twice told me, when I shared things about my family dynamics, that the most powerful thing a person could do in a complicated family situation was to make sure their paperwork was airtight. She did not mean it as wisdom at the time. She meant it practically. But I had started to understand the wisdom anyway. In the spring of the year Mateo turned 9, Rodrigo had a health scare, not the eventual heart attack. An episode that sent him to the emergency room in March, which turned out to be a stress-related arrhythmia, nothing structural, and he was back home within 48 hours. But it shook something loose in our household. He became quieter. He started talking more about planning, about making sure things were organized. He updated his will. He had me sign some paperwork related to beneficiary designations. I signed what he put in front of me because he was my husband and I trusted him, and I was not a suspicious person. I am writing that sentence and understanding, as I write it, how many betrayals fit inside the phrase I was not a suspicious person. The summer Mateo turned 10, Daniel moved from Portland back to Columbus. He said it was for a job, a regional sales director role with a company that distributed medical equipment. He found an apartment 20 minutes from our house. Mateo was delighted. I was genuinely glad. It did not occur to me to map the timing. Daniel started coming around more. He would take Mateo to the park on Saturdays when Rodrigo was traveling. He would help with homework projects. He would sometimes pick Mateo up from school when I had a late client meeting and our usual arrangements had fallen through. I thanked him. Rodrigo thanked him. We both said multiple times that we did not know what we would do without him. I know now that this was not a coincidence. None of it was. The attorney's name is Glenn Vasquez. I want to name him here, and I want to be precise about this, because he is part of what comes later, and I need you to understand that the things that happened were not things I discovered after the fact and reacted to emotionally. Some of them, yes, but some of them I had been building a response to for longer than anyone in my family knew. I first called Glenn Vasquez on October 14th, about 3 months after Rodrigo died. I called him because Christine Ackafer, my financial advisor, had flagged something while helping me go through Rodrigo's estate documents. She had found a discrepancy in the beneficiary structure of one of his private accounts. She had said, carefully, that I should speak to an attorney before I did anything else. She had recommended Glenn specifically. Glenn is a family law and estate attorney with a small practice in Columbus. He is thorough in a way that makes the meetings long, but makes the documents bulletproof. He had gone through everything with me: the will, the beneficiary designations, the joint accounts, the insurance policies. He had found things. He had not told me the full scope of what he found in that first meeting because he needed more time to trace the documentation. But he had told me enough that when I left his office on October 14th, I drove to a parking garage 3 blocks away and sat in my car for 22 minutes before I was capable of moving. What I knew by then, before the funeral, before Daniel's hallway revelation, was this: that money had been moving out of accounts in Rodrigo's name in ways that did not match household expenses. That one specific outflow, totaling $180,000 over the span of approximately 4 years, was documented, but its destination was not immediately traceable through the standard estate records. That Glenn had flagged it and was continuing to investigate. And that there was a clause in Rodrigo's updated will, an amendment added in the final year of his life, that redirected a portion of the estate in a direction Glenn described as unusual given our family structure. $180,000. The number was sitting in me like something swallowed wrong when Daniel pulled me into that hallway and told me he had been raising my son. And then he said, "And your husband took $180,000 for." And that is when I turned and walked back into the hall. And that is when I asked him to say all of it again in front of everyone. Daniel followed me because he did not have a choice, or maybe because some part of him had wanted this to surface for longer than I knew. The family photos he had brought, 8 years of them in a folder on his phone, were photographs I had never seen. School events, doctor's visits, a birthday party in a park I did not recognize with decorations I had not chosen. My son's face happy and real, in moments I had been absent from without knowing I was absent. He showed them to the room. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. My Aunt Rosario, who is my mother's younger sister and had driven 4 hours for the funeral, made a sound I cannot describe. Rodrigo's sister, Camilla, who was standing by the coffee table with a plate she set down very slowly, looked at me with an expression that told me this was not new information to her. That expression on Camilla's face was the second thing that took the floor out from under me. And somewhere in the room, at the edge of where the folding tables met the wall, a woman I did not immediately recognize was watching. She had arrived at the church with the other guests, had signed the book in the vestibule, had taken a seat near the back. I had not registered her specifically during the service, but she had been there. And she was still there now, standing against the wall with her coat folded over her arm, watching Daniel with an expression that was something between sorrow and something I can only call relief. I did not know who she was yet. I would find out very shortly. But first, Daniel had more to say. His voice, in front of 62 people holding cups of coffee and plates of food that nobody was eating anymore, had lost the careful, rehearsed texture it had in the hallway. He was saying things in a different order than he had planned to say them, I think, because the room had changed what was possible. He was showing photographs and talking about school pickups and therapy sessions. Yes, Mateo had been in therapy for 2 years that I apparently had not known about, and he was talking about the money, how Rodrigo had come to him, how there was an arrangement, how he had thought I knew more than I knew, how he had assumed, and then the police arrived. Not because I had called them. I had not had the presence of mind to call them. They arrived because someone else had. I found out later it was Christine Ackafer, who had been monitoring the estate investigation closely enough that, when Glenn Vasquez had reported the financial documentation to the appropriate authorities 3 days before the funeral, there was already a process in motion that did not require my initiation. Two officers came through the side entrance of the hall. They were not dramatic about it. They did not shout. One of them asked, in a voice calibrated to be heard by exactly the people who needed to hear it and no one unnecessary, whether a man named Daniel Ferreira was present. The room went the way rooms go when something irreversible begins. Daniel turned toward the door. He had the folder of photographs still in his hand. He looked at the officers. He looked at me. And the expression on his face was not guilt exactly. It was something older than guilt. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something for 8 years and had just finally set it down, not by choice but because his hands had given out. My mother said his name, just his name, once. Camilla across the room put her plate on the nearest table and folded her arms and looked at the wall. I understood then that whatever she knew, she had been knowing it alone for some time. The woman near the back, the one with the coat over her arm, took a small step forward. One of the officers looked at her, and she gave a slight nod, and he nodded back. She was not random. She was not a neighbor or a church acquaintance or a coworker of Rodrigo's who had come to pay respects. She was there specifically. She had come there for this moment. I had 30 seconds, maybe 40, before everything accelerated, and I used them to stand very still in the center of the room and understand that the morning I was in was not the morning I had woken up inside of. That the story I was part of had been running underneath, the story I thought I was part of for 8 years, maybe longer. That my son, my 12-year-old son who had his father's forehead and my grandmother's eyes, had been living in two stories simultaneously. And he had not been able to tell me. And I needed to sit with the possibility that there was a reason he had not been able to, and that the reason had a name, and possibly more than one name, and that I was going to have to learn all of them before this was over. Glenn Vasquez had told me, in our last conversation 3 days before the funeral, that the documentation was nearly complete, that what he had found was significant, that I should be prepared for the coming weeks to require more of me than I expected. He had said it in the measured way he says most things, with the kind of precision that comes from having delivered hard information to people who were not ready for it many times before. I had thought I was ready. I had not understood yet what I was being made ready for. The officer was speaking Daniel's name again. The room was a held breath. My mother had her hands pressed together in front of her mouth, not praying, just pressing, the way she does when she is trying to hold something inside herself that is too large to hold. And I was standing in the middle of the church hall at my son's funeral, in the dress I had bought for my husband's funeral 8 months before, with $106,000 in a college account for a child who was no longer living, and I was about to learn the rest of the story. I want you to understand that I was not passive in what happened next. What happened in the following weeks was not something that was done to me. I had already been moving. I had already been building. Glenn Vasquez and Christine Acaffer had not been idle. The account I had kept separate, the college fund I had grown through every bonus and every year-end distribution and every quiet decision not to mention it to anyone in my family, had never been accessible to Rodrigo. It was in my name only. A trustee structure that Christine had recommended when Mateo was 4 years old, so that the funds would flow to Mateo's benefit through a designated adult trustee if anything happened to me, and could not be touched by anyone else under any circumstances. Daniel had not known about it. Rodrigo had not known the full extent of it. My mother had never known it existed. That account was the reason I was not destroyed. That and the recording. But I am getting ahead of where I am in this story. The point is this: the police arriving at my son's funeral was not the beginning of something. It was the surface of something that had been underneath everything for 8 years. And I had been preparing for a version of this surface, not this exact version, not the photographs and the hallway and the speech Daniel had clearly been rehearsing, but some version of a truth I had felt in the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. Quiet, unmistakable, present. Christine had said, 6 months before Rodrigo died, that I should make sure every account I cared about had a paper trail that was mine. Not ours. Mine. I had looked at her across her desk and I had said, "Is there something I should know?" And she had said, "There is something you should be prepared for." And she had not said more than that. And I had not asked more than that. And now I was standing in the church hall with my arms at my sides and the police at the door and my brother's face full of something that looked, finally, like the truth. I was ready. I was not ready. Both of those things were true at the same time, in the way that most important things are. The two officers were patient. That is the word I keep coming back to. They were patient in the way that people are when they have done something many times and understand that the doing of it changes the room permanently, and there is no use rushing the change. One of them, the taller one, had a clipboard. He did not use it immediately. He just held it and waited, while Daniel stood in the middle of the church hall with his folder of photographs and the whole architecture of his secret rearranging itself around him in real time. My mother moved first. She crossed the hall toward Daniel with her arms slightly out, the way she moves when she is trying to contain something before it gets larger. Her voice was a whisper that carried farther than she intended. Daniel, Daniel, do not say another word. Daniel looked at her. Then he looked at me. His eyes were doing something I had not seen from him since we were children, and he had broken my mother's good lamp and was deciding whether to confess or deflect. The deciding. He was still doing the deciding, even now at 41 years old at his nephew's funeral, with two police officers standing 12 feet away. Mom, he said, and his voice broke on just that one syllable. The officer with the clipboard took a step forward. Mr. Ferreira, we'd appreciate a few minutes of your time outside. Daniel's gaze swept the room. 62 people, and not one of them was looking away. My Aunt Rosario had her hand pressed flat against her sternum. Rodrigo's sister Camilla was standing with her arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were whitened, and she was not looking at Daniel. She was looking at me. The expression had not changed since I had seen it minutes earlier. Still, that complicated mix of grief and something that looked, from where I stood, like the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a secret they did not choose and could not put down. The woman near the back wall, the one with the coat folded over her arm, took another slow step into the room. She had dark hair, cut short, and she moved with a deliberateness that distinguished her from everyone else in the hall, who were moving reactively, instinctively, the way people move when they do not know what to do with their bodies. I looked at her directly for the first time. She held my gaze without flinching. And I understood in the way you understand things that arrive fully formed in a moment of shock that she had been waiting for me to look at her. Who are you? My voice came out steadier than I expected. It surprised me. My name is Renata Solis. A pause. She glanced briefly at Daniel before returning to me. I was your husband's financial advisor, his private one, not the firm's. The room took that in. I took that in. Daniel put his hand over his eyes. He was not crying. He was doing something else, something more like a person who has walked into a room and found that all the furniture has been rearranged and cannot locate the place where he expected to stand. I had exactly two questions, and I understood that the timing of the next minutes mattered more than anything else. Glenn Vasquez had told me, in the conversation 3 days before the funeral, that there was a moment coming where I would need to be very clear about what I wanted to happen. Not emotional. Clear. I had asked him what he meant by clear. He had said, you need to know in advance whether you want law or settlement, because once the law begins, it does not stop for sentiment. I had told him I wanted the law. He had said, then when the moment arrives, do not interfere with it. Let it move. So I did not interfere. The officer with the clipboard had a conversation with Daniel near the side entrance that lasted approximately 6 minutes. I know the duration because Rosario was standing close enough to me that I could hear her breathing, and I counted her breaths to give myself something to anchor to. Daniel left with both officers, not in handcuffs. That distinction mattered less than I thought it would. He left, and the side door closed behind him, and the hall reconfigured itself around his absence. My mother stood with her back to the room for a long moment. When she turned, her face had done something I had never seen it do before. It had simply stopped performing. Everything she usually held in place, the composure, the authority, the particular set of her expression that said she had already assessed the situation and found it manageable, all of it had dissolved. What was underneath was just a woman who did not know what to do with her hands. Renata Solis was still in the room. I looked at her. I think, I said, measuring each word, that we should talk, not here, tomorrow. She gave a single nod. She took a card from her coat pocket and set it on the nearest folding table, the way you set something down when you know it will be picked up. Then she gathered her coat over her arm again and walked out through the main entrance without another word. If you're still with me, stay, because what happened in the days between that moment and what came next is the reason this story has an ending. Glenn Vasquez's office is on the fifth floor of a building downtown that has a view of the river if you sit in the right chair. I was in the right chair the following morning at 9:45. Renata Solis was across the table. Glenn was at the head, with a legal pad and the particular quality of stillness he gets when the information in the room requires him to listen before he speaks. Renata had been, she explained, in a professional relationship with Rodrigo that began approximately 5 years before his death. He had come to her privately, not through any firm referral, through a personal contact with a specific request. He wanted to structure a series of transfers that would move money out of his estate holdings in a way that would not be immediately traceable through standard probate review. Glenn's pen stopped. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. And you complied. I counseled against it 3 times in writing. Her voice was even. When he insisted, I documented every objection and retained copies. Those copies are what I brought this morning. She set a folder on the table. Glenn opened it. I watched his expression do the thing it does when he is processing something significant, a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause before he turns the page. The amount Rodrigo had moved through the arrangement Renata had described was $180,000, transferred over the course of 4 years into an account in Daniel's name, not as a gift, not as a loan. Structured according to the documents Renata had retained, as payment for services rendered. Services that were, in the documentation Rodrigo had provided to Renata, described as childcare and household management. Rodrigo had been paying Daniel to be present in Mateo's life, not as an uncle, not as family. As a contracted substitute for the presence Rodrigo himself was not providing. I sat with that for a long time after Glenn said it out loud. The full shape of it. Rodrigo traveling constantly not for work alone, but because he had arranged a replacement. The school pickups, the homework, the therapy Mateo had been in for 2 years, all of it funded through a transfer structure that Rodrigo had taken care to hide from me, from the estate, from anyone who might question it. The question I kept not asking out loud was, why? Why not just tell me? Why not just say, I am not enough for this child, I need help, our marriage is not what I thought it was, something is wrong. Why construct an entire hidden architecture instead of a conversation? Glenn looked at me. He said quietly that he thought the answer was in the will amendment. He turned to a different section of the folder. The amendment that Rodrigo had added to his will in the final year of his life redirected a portion of his estate holdings to Daniel. Not all, not even most, but a significant portion of one investment property's equity, approximately $340,000 at assessed value, structured as a bequest contingent on Daniel's continued involvement in Mateo's life and education. Rodrigo had been trying, in the only way he apparently knew how, to make sure Mateo was taken care of after he was gone. He had known, or suspected, that he would not be there, and he had not trusted me to provide what he thought Mateo needed. Was the part that cost the most to understand, not the money, the trust. Glenn set the folder down. He folded his hands. Nora, a pause. The transfer structure Rodrigo used does constitute financial misconduct relative to the estate. The bequest to Daniel is contestable given that it was funded partly through marital assets, and Daniel's acceptance of payment without disclosing the arrangement to you creates a separate exposure for him. From across the table, Renata spoke carefully. I retained documentation because I believed this moment would come. I did not intend to bring it to a funeral. But when I learned when the service was, and that Daniel planned to speak, I made a decision. What kind of decision? I asked. To be present, in case you needed the information before it was too late for it to matter. I looked at her for a long moment. She had come to my son's funeral, a woman I had never met because she had decided that I deserved to know what she knew before the man who had hidden it from me could control how I received it. I did not have words for what that was. Still do not? Thank you, I said. It was not enough. It was what I had. Glenn and I spent 3 hours that morning mapping the legal landscape. The transfers from the marital estate were recoverable. The contested bequest would go through probate challenge, a process that Glenn estimated would take between 8 and 14 months. Daniel's exposure depended on what the financial forensics showed about his awareness of the estate structure, which Renata's documentation would be central to establishing. When I left Glenn's office at just past 1 in the afternoon, I stood on the sidewalk in the February cold and called Christine Ackefer. I told her what I had learned. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about Christine. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, the college account is clean, nothing touches it. I know. Good. Another pause. What do you need from me right now? I need you to be available when Glenn calls. He's going to want the full picture of the separate accounts. I'll clear my afternoon. I stood on that sidewalk for another moment after we hung up. The cold was specific and real, and I felt it in a way I had not felt physical sensations for the past several days, since the numbness that sets in after burying a child had made everything slightly distant. The cold was present. I was present in it. $106,000 in an account no one had touched. A financial advisor who had kept her documentation. An estate attorney who had found the thread 8 months earlier and had been pulling it since. And a brother who had walked into a church hall with a folder of photographs, intending, I think, to finally tell me something he had been holding for 8 years, and who had not understood that the thing he was confessing to had already been half uncovered by people I had put in place for exactly this contingency. I had not anticipated the specific shape of what I was walking into, but I had anticipated that the shape would come, and I had not been standing still while I waited for it. That was the day I called Glenn back at 4 in the afternoon and told him we were moving forward on everything. The probate challenge, the transfer recovery, all of it. He said he would begin drafting the filings that week. I said, begin today. The next time I was in a room with Daniel was 6 weeks later, in February, in a conference room in Glenn's office building. It was not the same building as the church hall. It was not a family gathering. It was a table with attorneys on both sides, and a court reporter in the corner, and no casseroles, and no folding chairs, and no one performing comfort at anyone else. Daniel had hired an attorney named Franklin Osai, a compact man with a careful manner and a very good suit. I noticed the suit because I notice things like that now, the way you do when you have spent years being underestimated in rooms by people who did not think you were paying attention. Glenn and Franklin had exchanged documents for the past 6 weeks. This meeting was the first time Daniel and I had been in the same room since the police took him out through the side door of St. Augustine's. Daniel looked reduced. That is the word, not physically. He had not lost weight or aged dramatically in 6 weeks. But something structural in him that I had always taken as a given, the particular confidence of a person who believes they understand the situation better than the people around them, was gone. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and when I came in, he looked at me and then looked at the table, and he did not look up again for a long time. Franklin opened the meeting. My client acknowledges the transfers, he said. He disputes the characterization of his role as constituting financial conspiracy. His position is that he was acting on your husband's instructions in good faith and without full understanding of the estate implications. Glenn did not look up from his notes. The documentation indicates Mr. Ferrara was provided with a written summary of the estate structure at the time of the initial transfer. Renata Solis' records confirm this. A pause. Franklin's expression did something brief and contained. He had not known about Renata's documentation. His preparation had a gap in it, and he was adjusting in real time. Franklin said, "We may need to revisit that point." Glenn set a page on the table between the two sides. "We'd like to do that now." I watched Daniel's hands on the table. They did not move. He was very still in the way of someone who has decided that stillness is the safest available option. His attorney leaned toward him and said something in a low voice, and Daniel gave a small, tight nod. "My client," Franklin said, after a moment, "is prepared to discuss a structure for restitution." "We are not here to discuss restitution," Glenn said. He said it calmly, the way he says most things, and it landed in the room with the weight of something that had been decided before the meeting began. "We are here to formalize the parameters of the estate recovery and to address the documentation of the arrangement your client entered into with Mr. Rodrigo Ferreira, which we intend to present to the court as evidence of an orchestrated effort to divert marital assets." Daniel made a sound, not a word, a sound. Franklin put a hand on his arm without looking at him. I looked at Daniel directly. He had to meet my eyes eventually. When he did, I did not look away. "You could have told me," I said. My voice came out level, not angry, level, at any point in 8 years. "Any dinner, any phone call, any morning when you drove to our house to pick up my son. You could have said, 'Nora, your husband came to me, and this is what he asked me to do, and I think you should know.'" Daniel's throat moved. "He said you knew. He said the two of you had agreed to it." "Did I ever give you any indication that I knew?" His hands pressed flat against the table. "No." "Did Mateo ever seem unhappy?" His voice came out rougher. "No, he was a good kid. He was." He stopped. I let the silence hold for 4 full seconds. Then, "I know he was. I was his mother." Franklin Osa began to speak, and I turned my eyes to him, and he stopped. Glenn said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." During the recess, I stood at the window at the end of the hall that had the view of the river Glenn's office had on a smaller scale. The February sky was the color of old paper. I thought about Mateo at age 7, showing me a drawing he had made at school, a house with a red roof and 4 stick figures in front of it. I had asked him who the people were. He had pointed and said, "You and Dad and Uncle Dan and me." I had thought nothing of it. I had put the drawing on the refrigerator. The refrigerator was still there in the house. The drawing was still on it. I had not been able to take it down. When we returned to the table, Daniel's attorney had adjusted his position. The acknowledgement of the transfers was now broader. The question of Daniel's full awareness of the estate implications was, Franklin conceded after reviewing the additional documentation Glenn presented, more difficult to dispute than previously assessed. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was methodical. Glenn laid out the documented transfers, one by one, and the corresponding entries in Renata Solis's retained records, and the communications between Rodrigo and Daniel that Renata had also preserved. Each page landed on the table between us, and Daniel looked at each one with the expression of someone recognizing items from a room they had hoped to keep locked. At the fourth document, Franklin asked for a second recess. They were outside for 11 minutes. When they came back, Franklin's posture had changed. He was sitting differently, angled more toward his client than toward the opposing side, which is what attorneys do when they are managing a client's reaction rather than advancing an argument. Daniel spoke without being directed to. His attorney placed a hand on the table between them, a small stopping gesture, and Daniel looked at it and then spoke anyway. I want her to hear it. His voice had gone rough in the way of someone who has been holding a large weight for a long time and has finally decided to put it down regardless of where they are standing. I want Nora to hear it from me. Franklin said his name, a warning. I need her to understand that I thought he had told her. A pause. In the beginning, I thought it was something you two had worked out. By the time I understood that you didn't know, it had been 3 years, and by then, he stopped, pressed his hands flat. By then, I thought stopping would hurt Mateo more than continuing. I looked at my brother. He was 41 years old, and he looked older than that and younger than that simultaneously, which is what grief does to a face when it is genuine. You thought it would hurt Mateo, I said. He was used to me. He counted on me being there. He was my son. The words came out quietly. Whatever Rodrigo told you, whatever arrangement you two constructed, he was my son and you took 8 years of information about his life and you kept it from me. That is not protecting him. That is making a choice about what I deserve to know. Franklin Osai was not speaking. He had put his pen down some moments before. He was listening, which meant he had assessed that intervention was not available to him in this moment and was choosing to document instead. Daniel's mouth opened, closed. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him since we were teenagers, and something had gone genuinely, irreversibly wrong between us. A fight over something I can no longer remember the specifics of, only the feeling of it, the feeling of watching someone you love look at you from the other side of a line they have crossed. I'm sorry, he said. It came out plainly. Not a performance, just the words. I believed him. That was the part that was hardest. I believed the apology, and it did not change anything, and I was aware of both of those facts at the same time without one canceling the other. Glenn set the next document on the table. The third hour of that meeting was where the architecture of what Rodrigo had done became fully visible. Renata's documentation was comprehensive. She had retained not just transfer records but communications, written in Rodrigo's own hand, that made clear he had understood the estate implications. He had known the money was moving out of shared holdings. He had known I did not have visibility into those accounts. He had made specific choices about maintaining my ignorance, and he had made them deliberately, over 4 years, in writing. When Glenn laid the final communications document on the table, Daniel did not look at it. He looked at the wall to his left, the way people look at blank surfaces when they are trying to locate themselves in a situation that no longer has familiar landmarks. Franklin Ose reviewed the document for approximately 2 minutes. Then he set it down and looked at Glenn with an expression that had traveled a significant distance from where it had been at the beginning of the meeting. What is your client's position on settlement? He asked. Glenn said, full recovery of the transferred marital assets. That is $180,000. Documentation of the full payment structure for the probate court, and withdrawal of any contest to the estate amendment we're challenging. The bequest from Mr. Rodrigo Ferrera's estate is contingent on a continued relationship with my client's son. Glenn's voice did not change in any register. My client's son is deceased. The contingency no longer exists. The bequest reverts. The room held that for a moment. Franklin turned to his client. They had a conversation in low voices that I could not fully hear, but the shape of it was clear enough. Daniel's responses were short. At one point, he pressed both palms against his face and held them there. When Franklin turned back, he said, my client is prepared to agree to the restitution structure. He will need time to arrange the funds. Glenn said, 60 days. Franklin looked at his client. Daniel nodded, still looking at the wall. The papers that would formalize the agreement took another 2 weeks to draft correctly. I signed them on a Thursday afternoon in March in Glenn's office, while the river outside was beginning to show the first pale suggestion of spring beneath the gray. Glenn set the completed file in front of me, and I looked at my name at the bottom of the document, and I felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but was in the territory adjacent to both. Something like the sensation of having put something down that you had been carrying for so long you had stopped noticing the weight. The probate court accepted the documentation in April. The contested bequest reverted. Daniel made the first payment against the restitution agreement within the 60 days as required. The estate, reconstructed to reflect the actual marital asset position, passed to me as surviving spouse without the diversion Rodrigo had structured. Camilla came to see me 2 weeks after the settlement. She arrived at my door on a Saturday morning, and I let her in, and we sat at my kitchen table with coffee, and she told me what she had known. She had learned of Rodrigo's arrangement with Daniel approximately 2 years before Rodrigo's death, when Rodrigo had confided in her during a visit. She had told him he needed to tell me. He had said he would. He had not. She had lived with that for 2 years, and then she had lived with it through his death and through Mateo's death and through the funeral, and the expression I had seen on her face in the church hall was the expression of a person who had finally reached the point where living with it was no longer possible. She did not ask for my forgiveness. I respected that. She said she was sorry. She said she had been wrong to wait. She said she understood if I could not be in her life. I thought about it. I looked at her across the kitchen table, and I thought about the fact that she had told Rodrigo to be honest and that he had not listened, and that she had carried his failure as though it were hers. I don't know yet, I said. It was the most honest thing I could offer. She nodded. She drank her coffee. We sat in something that was not yet forgiveness and was not resentment either. It was just two women at a kitchen table, both of us trying to locate the thing that came next. My mother called me in April. She did not mention Daniel for the first 12 minutes of the conversation. She talked about the weather and a neighbor's tree and whether I was eating. Then she said quietly that she hoped I knew she had not known about any of it. She said it in a way that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, which is how my mother says the things that cost her. I told her I believed her. She exhaled. Then she said, I always worried about your brother. A pause. Not you. I always thought you knew where you were going. I had nothing to say to that for a moment. Then, you never said that. I know. Her voice was smaller than I was used to hearing it. I should have. We are not repaired, my mother and I, but we are talking. That is more than I had on the morning of the funeral, when I stood in the church hall in my recycled black dress counting faces. It is not nothing. Daniel's criminal exposure was assessed by the district attorney's office after reviewing the transfer documentation. The transfers did not rise to the level of criminal fraud because Daniel had not initiated them and had not misrepresented himself to a financial institution. His attorney's strategy of establishing good faith partial awareness was, in the end, sufficient to keep the matter civil rather than criminal. I did not fight that assessment. I had the restitution. I had the estate. I had the truth. I understood that wanting a criminal conviction on top of all of that would be wanting something for a different reason than justice, and I did not have the energy for that reason. Daniel paid the full $180,000 within the 60-day period. He sold his apartment to do it. He is living in Portland again. He sent me one message in June, a short one, asking if there was anything of Mateo's he could have. A photograph, he said. He understood if the answer was no. I sent him the drawing from the refrigerator. The stick figures with the red-roofed house. Me and Rodrigo and Daniel and Mateo in a row in front of the house where we had all, for a period of time, been something like a family. I do not know what he did with it. I did not ask. Some things you release without needing to know where they land. The college account, the $106,000 I had grown in Mateo's name through 12 years of bonuses and quiet decisions, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told to be realistic and had chosen instead to be prepared, that money is in a donor-advised fund now. I set it up with Christine's help in the spring. It supports an education nonprofit in Columbus that works with children who have experienced family disruption. It is the best thing I know how to do with an account that was built for a child who is gone. Christine said, when we set it up, that Mateo would have thought it was a good idea. I told her she was probably right. He had been the kind of child who, at 10 years old, had asked me what the word philanthropy meant and then used it correctly in a sentence 3 days later. He had been paying attention. He always had. I am 39 years old, and I am living in the house on the suburb street that Rodrigo and I said was temporary and was not, and I am going to work in the morning and coming home in the evening and learning slowly what the shape of a life looks like when it has been rebuilt from its foundation rather than its surface. It is not the life I planned. Most of the best things I have built were not planned. They were prepared for. Glenn Vasquez closed my file in July. The last time I sat in his office with the river view, he said, as I was leaving, that he had handled a great many estate disputes and family situations, and that in his experience, the ones that ended in any kind of clarity were the ones where someone had made decisions ahead of the crisis rather than during it. I said I had been lucky to have good advice early. He said, that's not luck, that's character. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at the kitchen table in the house where the refrigerator now has nothing on it, and I thought about Mateo and Rodrigo and Daniel and Christine and Glenn and Renata Solis, who came to my son's funeral for a woman she had never met because she had decided that the truth was worth showing up for. I have been called a lot of things since that February. Difficult, litigious, cold. My mother's neighbor told her that I had been unnecessarily hard on my brother, that family is family, that some things are better handled quietly. I heard that and I thought about the stick figure drawing on the refrigerator. And then I thought about 12 years of my son's life that I understood differently now than I had the morning I buried him. And I thought about $180,000 moving through accounts I did not know existed, and a therapy practice I had not known my son attended, and 8 years of school pickups that had looked, from inside my life, like the ordinary texture of a family that was doing fine. Some things are better handled quietly. I used to believe that. I believe it a little less now. So, did I go too far or not nearly far enough? Tell me in the comments.